Hey, good evening, or good morning, or good afternoon, good night, whatever it is in your part of the world where you're watching us. I'm Chuck, and Brock is with me too. And this is our double feature. So for a while, we weren't able to do our Thursday get-togethers, where Brock and I spend some time talking about books that we have been reading other than Herman Bavinck's Reformed Dogmatics. But now November has arrived here in our part of the world, and well, your part of the world as well. And we are back to our Thursday discussions. And what we're going to do today, Brock and I talked a little bit, and what we're going to do is we're going to go through a short little book, just a real thin little book by Dr. Richard Mouw, entitled "He Shines in All That's Fair, Culture and Common Grace." And it's really an interesting book. I'll tell you, Brock, I've had this book for some time, and just, it was just on the list of books that I needed to read. And then probably about maybe a year ago, maybe a little bit less, one of my book clubs, a group of guys, mostly from my church, a couple of other churches in the area. We get together every other week or so for breakfast. We go to Venny's Pancake House, which is the best breakfast place in all of Sheboygan. And maybe I'll get some free breakfast for promoting that. And we get together and have breakfast and talk about the books that we're reading. And lo and behold, we were talking about, well, what should we read? And a couple of people said, hey, Richard Mouw, he's written some good stuff. And I said, hey, you know what? I've read a couple of books by Richard Mouw, but I haven't read this one yet. I haven't read He Shines in All That's Fair, and I hear a lot of good stuff about it. So how about that one? And so we did. We read through it and went through, it's because, again, it's a fairly thin book, got through it fairly quickly, and had some really, really good discussion. We really enjoyed reading through it. And so then, as Brock and I had been talking a little bit about some books, this book had also been on our list, and I said, "Hey, let's talk about He Shines in All That's Fair." And Brock, thank you for agreeing, because I think it could make for some really, really neat discussion. And so I'm really looking forward to that. And before we start, just a little bit of an introduction. Dr. Mouw is a professor. He's taught at Calvin College and for some time, but then he was at Fuller Seminary for many years. Dr. Mouw is sometimes called one of the Fab Four of Calvin College. There was a group of men who graduated from Calvin College all around the same time, probably, I'm gonna guess, early 1960s, maybe late 50s, and into the 60s. And all four of them became quite prominent folks in their fields. They all taught for some time at Calvin College, but then also went elsewhere and came to be fairly well known. And Dr. Mouw is one of those. And and so some really he's sort of well known even outside of Reformed circles. One of the favorite things I love quoting this. Mouw very much identifies as part of the Calvinist movement, very much considers himself Reformed. And I heard him lecture. He was going around the country giving some lectures supporting a different book that he wrote called Calvinism in the Las Vegas Airport. And I heard him speak, and he was talking a little bit about how are Calvinists, how are Reformed folks perceived in the world. And he told a story that, and I may have told the story on here before, I don't know, but I'm going to repeat it even if I have. And so he tells the story about how his son, who is a history professor at the University of Iowa, was teaching about the Puritans. And of course, the Puritans were were Reformed. They were a particular branch of the Reformed movement, important folks in U.S. history by all accounts. And so he spent some time talking about the Puritans, lecturing about the Puritans. And at the end of that section, he made a comment. He says, a lot of times when I teach you folks, I make you read original sources. And he sort of apologized. He said, I didn't have you read any original sources from the Puritans. And, I apologize for that. You should read some of the original sources. And he talked about some of the people they talked about. The most common one that is often read is Sinners in the Hand of an Angry God. But there are others. And he said, I'm sorry that I didn't do that. And, I don't know why I didn't, but we should have you do that. And some of the students were kind of responding and saying, well, no, that's okay. We're not sure we want to read the original sources of the Puritans. And so Professor Mouw's son asks, he says, well, why? Why wouldn't you want to read the Puritans in their original form? And sitting sort of in the back of the classroom, one of the college students kind of slouched back, hat backwards, probably his backpack slung across his back, ready to leave the classroom. And he says, well, why wouldn't you want to read the Puritans in as primary sources? And the kid says, dude, Calvinists are scary. And Mouw hears this from his son and kind of laughs, and they get a kick out of it, like, oh, I guess we're kind of scary. But then Mouw said, sometimes Calvinists are scary. Now, some of that is perhaps a misunderstanding of Calvinist theology. There are some, sort of stereotypes of Calvinism that are out there in the world today that might lead to college students thinking that Calvinists are scary. But what Mouw did is he said, look, it's a stereotype. The stereotype might be based in, it takes a little kernel of the truth and then expands it beyond the truth. And he said, look, we Reformed folks, we think we've got this treasure. We know we have this treasure, but if people think it's scary, they're not gonna receive that treasure. And so part of his comment, and part of why he wrote Calvinism in the Las Vegas Airport, is talking about, well, how do we present core Calvinist beliefs and Calvinist philosophy and Reformed theology, and how do we do that in a way that, hey, you run into somebody at the Las Vegas Airport and you explain to them and they go on, and it's sort of like you talk about elevator speeches and things like that. And frankly, what Professor Mouw was talking about is how can we as Reformed folks be generous with our theology? And given our title of our discussions here, I thought, that really is what he's talking about. One other thing I'll mention is, again, it's written as a book called He Shines in All That's Fair, but a little bit of a history of where this comes from. So at Calvin College, there is a lecture series, the Henry Staub Lectures, that are, I think they're most years, although I noticed there are a few of the lectures that are missing off of their website in recent years. But Dr. Mouw was the keynote speaker at the Staub Lectures in 2000, and he gave 3 speeches during the Staub Lectures, one called Seeking the Common Good, one called He Shines in All That's Fair, and one called Lessons from the Labadists, or Labadists, I don't know how to pronounce that word. And those lectures were turned into chapters in this book, and then he sort of expanded that to create this little book. So this really is a result and an expansion of his speeches at the 2000 Staub Lectures. And those lectures are, there are some pretty impressive folks who've spoken at these lectures over the year. Alvin Plantinga spoke in 1989, Peter Kreeft in 1988. More recently, William Lane Craig has spoken, John Whitty, Cornelius Plantinga, Willie James Jennings, N.T. Wright, and so really some really interesting people who are doing scholarship, but doing scholarship in a way that's meant to be also reachable and generous, so that others can hear about it. So that's a little bit of the background of what we're going to be talking about over the next few weeks. And so, but Brock, maybe before we get into the content a little bit, I'd be interested. We're both in the Reformed camp, but we come from slightly different branches of that Reformed tree, and I'd be interested. Mouw comes from my branch, so I know a lot about him. But I'm interested in knowing a little bit. What did you know of Richard Mouw, and what led you to say, sure, Chuck, we'll read this book when I suggested it, other than maybe you're just a nice guy and wanted to make me feel good.
Well, thank you, my friend. Yeah, I'm looking at the Staub Lectures list, and you mentioned some of the participants there. Ellen Cherry, who we read about, I think, was it in the Oxford Handbook of the Psalms? Gave the lectures in 2005. That was interesting to me. N.T. Wright gave the lectures 1 year. William Lane Craig, who you pointed out. Eleanor Stump has given lectures there. Also, George Mavrodes, a name that's interesting to me. You mentioned Peter Kreeft, Louis Smedes also. So a really interesting source for lectures. And I think we're going to be blessed by this particular set. So my involvement and how it came to be. So I'm from the trying to think of the right word. The region where I'm from is very the kind of Calvinism represented by the Fab Four of Calvin College is very much looked down upon as being compromising in a modernistic, liberal sort of way, too intellectual, too much give and take. And so I thought as a young Calvinist, I said, well, I'm going to look at and read Dr. Mouw and some other folks associated with Calvin, and I found that it was a very different taste in Calvinism than I knew in my early Calvinist years. But over the years, it has worn well, and my tastes have shifted perhaps more in that direction, and maybe out of the MMA cage match that is sometimes Calvinist dynamics. So in these lectures, there is a doctrine, a central doctrine being discussed that is at stake, and that's the doctrine common grace. And there's such an amazing there really is a need to tackle this. You already mentioned that the Staub lectures came in 3 different particular addresses in the year 2000. Tonight we're taking a look at chapter 1 from the book, Thinking About Commonness. The other ones you mentioned, Lessons from the Labadists, He Shines in All That's Fair, Infra versus Supra, the 5th chapter, Seeking the Common Good, and then finally, Updating Common Grace Theology. And I'm looking forward reading what he has to say and hearing his opinions. We, those of us who grew up on the wrong side of the train tracks, Calvinistically speaking, we're used to throwing a lot more punches than acting in a more academic and scholarly fashion, let's say. But I think it's important to be balanced. One of the ways in which we're generous is we give a balance to the best degree that we can. And Chuck, there's something about the doctrine of common grace that is really controversial and really needed. So when you suggested, why don't we read this? It's true that I wanted to have a book that you were excited about reading. That's true. But I myself was excited about it, and it would have been one of the books I would have been happy to suggest. So when you suggested it, I thought, wow, that's a good one right out of the gate for us to take some time with. And I think part of the reason why the doctrine of common grace is so controversial and provokes such a strong series of engagements is because it's linked with the Reformed idea of a Christian particularism. A Christian particularism. And the short story behind particularism is, it's the story of Romans 9:18, which is an exceedingly offensive verse to so many minds. Romans 9:18 says this: "So then God has mercy on whomever he wills, and he hardens whomever he wills." I think I was talking, I don't think I've shared this story here, had a very dear friend in the early 2000s. And that was one of their biggest objections as a non-Christian. How dare God treat some people in a particular fashion and not all? How dare God say, "I have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I harden whom I harden"? And the spirit behind that is really worth investigating and interacting with and engaging with. We have, as Reformed fellows, we have a Christian particularist position, which means that we're going to agree with that statement, maturely understood, carefully qualified, and made in a generous sort of way. But right away, you can see people stiffen. Wait, what? God treats people in a particular way? I thought he loved everybody. I thought he loved everybody the same. Chuck, those are not exactly the same statements. God, I thought he loved everybody, and then I thought he loved everybody the same. Those are not the same statements. And we need these lectures from Dr. Mouw to really go into some of why that should be. And so in this first chapter, we get to deal with the idea of commonness. So we hear people talk often, Chuck, about the brotherhood of man. And sometimes that's raised as an objection. God treats us all alike. There is a brotherhood of humankind. And one of the reasons why it's easy to trip up on this issue is because that statement can be true. There can be a brotherhood of humankind, and it can also, at the same time, be true that God is particular in his dispensation of grace. And so right away, we're confronted with the fact that theology can make us say things that require further examination, and that we have to be careful often sounds contradictory to people, or sounds like there's either a logical contradiction in that statement or perhaps an existential one. And so we have to, as theologians, we have to go through these things with care and subtlety and diplomatically and tactfully. And so thinking about commonness, Chuck, where do you want to begin when you think about those issues, and you think about sort of the stiffening of the spine that happens when people are confronted with Christian particularism, and also this idea of this commonness or this universal brotherhood? How does that start to unfold in your thinking?
So yeah, this is an important issue, and how we deal with this concept of common grace is really important, because I think there is a sense in which if we're not careful about how we speak about common grace, we can go too far to one side or the other, and of these doctrines, and there's some danger in those circumstances. And frankly, I think some of the history that Dr. Mouw will get into in this book, shows the fact that we can be somewhat uncareful about these distinctions, and what do we mean by this word common grace? Because certainly, I think all Reformed folks would say, would believe in particularism, as you describe it, that God's saving grace is particular to those that he has chosen, that he has elected. Reformed folks believe in that doctrine of election. So, the Protestant Reformed folks who separated from the Christian Reformed Church back in 1924, and we'll get a little bit more into that history at the right point. They make the point that you can, you got to stay away from sort of this idea that anybody can be saved as long as they, whether it's a universalism or whether it's an Arminianism that says, hey, you can choose to be saved. No, all Reformed folks will say that we believe in a form of particularism, that God has chosen from his own free will, those who will be elect, and those who are, and by virtue of that, those who are not elect, and he's made that decision, and that determines who is saved and who's not saved. And that can be hard for some people to hear. And in fact, there are some discussions that have continued in the Reformed world about, well, what do we mean by predestination? And, when we talk about predestination, is it a single predestination or is it a double predestination? Are people also predestined, to hell, or are they only predestined to grace? Those kinds of things. It's kind of uncomfortable sometimes to think about the fact that there are those who are not chosen. I can recall, I tell the story, this happened years and years ago. One of the first years that I taught high school students catechism in the church that I attend to now. I had taught it before in the church I attended prior when I lived in another community. But the church I attend in my community now, back in probably the late 1990s, I was teaching the Heidelberg Catechism, and I remember at one point there was a girl who, was kind of like, she seemed to be she had this kind of pained look in on her face as we were talking about predestination and depravity and those kinds of things, and she was like, yeah, it doesn't seem fair. And I'm like, well, what do you mean it doesn't seem fair? And she says, yeah, it's just not fair. I mean, God chooses some and not others. That doesn't seem fair to me. And so, as I was wont to do, I would allow students first to respond to her, see if anybody wanted to respond to it, and then see where the discussion went. And actually, I had some really good students in that class who right away they said, well, how is it unfair for God to punish sinful people? And what's happening here is that God is sort of out of his mercy and grace choosing people that, despite the fact that they're sinful, that they've rebelled against God, he's choosing people to bring them alive, and again to renew their hearts, renew their minds, and allow them to be saved as a result of that grace. And so we spent some time talking about that, and we got into issues of single and double, predestination, those kinds of things. And I thought, okay, this seems to be going pretty well. These students are talking about these issues pretty well. They seem to understand them. This group of kids, there's a couple of them that are pastors now. So this was a bright group of kids. And I thought, I'm thinking this girl, she's probably got a good answer. And so I kind of look at her and I said, yeah, does that make sense to you? And she still has this pained look on her face. She's kind of like, oh. And she says, no, it's not that. But what if you're what if you're one of the ones who isn't chosen? And I'm like, I see. This is the real concern here. It's like, how do we know? And so it was at that point where I pointed to, there's a section in the Canons of Dort that basically quote the verse about a bruised reed he will not strike, and basically saying, look, yeah, we're all sinners, but unrepentant sinners, they don't care about their sin, right? They don't care about issues about whether they might be saved because they're unrepentant sinners. You have just sort of proven to me that you are likely among the elect because you're worried about this issue. And what does it mean to be chosen? And you're looking at your own life, and and I wasn't going to get too deeply into this, but saying, you're looking at your own life and you're seeing things you don't like about your life. And you're concerned about that, but you're also concerned about it because you realize that you're not living up to what God wants you to live up to. But that very realization is a sign that God is working in your heart, working in your mind to allow that regeneration to occur. You're coming alive again in Christ. And I said to her, think of it this way. We just talked about total depravity, right? And total depravity is this idea that we're just so caught up in our sin that we can't do anything ourselves to save ourselves. And, knowing that, then, and knowing that we can't do anything to save ourselves, and yet when we see in our hearts even the weakest spark of a desire to live for Christ, well, that ought to tell you that that's Christ working in your heart. And it might only be this tiny little spark. You might feel like it's almost a spark that's going to go out. But if that's a concern to you, you can rely on God's grace, because God's grace, not only is it grace that he gives, but it's irresistible grace. It's unconditional election. He's not going to give up on this election because you went and did something you weren't supposed to do. He is going to pursue you because you are his chosen child. And at the end of that discussion, I don't know that the pained look ever totally got off of her face, but that might just be because Sunday school went long that day. But I came away convinced that she had a little better understanding of God's grace because of that discussion. And it's a neat thing, to think about that grace and to think about what it means for God's particular grace to be applied to us. Now, the other way, we can forget about that particular grace and get so caught up in the common grace that we start thinking everything is acceptable, and we can go also the other way and just sort of say, "Oh, this world is not my home, and just to passing through, and we don't care about anything else. We're just gonna live our lives and die and go to heaven." And neither of those are really, I think, what grace is all about. And we've got to be careful about the words we use. When we're not careful about the words we use, we sometimes end up, as happened in 1924, in a church schism that still exists today. The Protestant Reformed Church separated from the Christian Reformed Church, and we'll talk about a little bit more of the history of that. But I can tell you, having some friends who are Protestant Reformed, in the Protestant Reformed Church, they actually have curriculum on how to win over your Christian Reformed neighbors, because Protestant Reformed churches are mostly in communities that also have Christian Reformed churches. And the Christian Reformed Church, that they're just they're just unrepentant sinners because they believe in common grace. And but as we'll get into, there is more to this story here. And Richard Mouw will say, perhaps we weren't generous enough with those folks back in the day, and maybe there's something we ought to be doing about that, even if it doesn't result in a sort of a rapprochement or a remerger of the two denominations, but maybe there is something that we can do to talk about these issues. And frankly, that's a little bit why he wrote this book as well. Early in chapter 1, he makes the point that we do need to search for the proper grounds of commonness. We need to think about what it means to believe in common grace, but he also says we do need to be careful about becoming so common that it's not even grace anymore. And so I appreciate that willingness to sort of be balanced and think about those issues here. So Brock, I know that this is an interest of yours as well, and thinking a little bit about how this balance and thinking about particularism while still also having an understanding of common grace, how this all works together. And I'm interested in some of your thoughts. I know you've indicated in sort of the branch of the Reformed faith that you came up in, there was always this sort of little concern about those Fab Four, those Christian Reformed people who are maybe a little too intellectual, a little too a little off the liberal deep end at times. But I guess what I'm interested in is what led you to want to dive in to these issues and read about the sort of these issues and take some time to think through them. And were there any particular particular things that you were studying or that you ran into that led you to engage even more deeply in this conversation?
Yeah, my friend, I was so troubled by the traditional framing of the objection to Christian particularism. I was troubled by my friends, my non-believing friends' default intuitive notion that God owes everyone grace. We see that a lot in our culture, mostly among people with with bad boundaries, people who find it difficult to respect and hold a wholesome frame on certain topics. What do I mean by that? At some point, I realized that grace is an essentially particularistic word. For if God owes everyone, then it's not grace. He has a duty. He has an obligation. And the fact that he does not perform that saving, illuminating, and enlightening of all people in the same way, at the same time as he is ultimately obligated to do in the minds of some, that actually negates. Grace doesn't mean anything. But the Bible talks about grace in such clear and explicit terms that we recognize there has to be a particularism underlying it, or it's not grace. It's not free. And I think that led me into the realization that there's perhaps a default frame issue that I'm most concerned about. And let me explain why. Sometimes I will quote unquote shock people by telling them Romans 9:18 is one of my my favorite verses, my life verse. Oh, what's your life verse? Everybody wants John 3:16, and everybody wants one of the other. Look at what God has done for us. And those are wonderful verses, Chuck. I am not objecting. But then I'll throw out sometimes and say, Romans 9:18 is my life verse. He has mercy on whom he will have mercy, and he hardens whom he will harden. Precisely to draw out that poison. Well, that doesn't seem fair. Friends, if the mercy of God depends upon your evaluation of fairness, then there is no room to call it gracious. There's no room to call it grace, because God is simply dispensing what people are entitled to. Come on, God. Give it up, God. Where's my grace? And I think in the light of that reframe, in the light of that inversion of the scenario, something wholesome happens. Now, related to this is this idea of the fear of the Lord. And you and I have talked about this a lot, Chuck. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. We have in Matthew chapter 7 a statement that is shocking and ought to shock. Jesus says in regard to true disciples, starting in verse 21, not everyone who calls out to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. On judgment day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, we prophesied in your name. We cast out demons in your name. We performed many miracles in your name. But I will reply, Jesus says, I never knew you. Get away from me. The particularism of our theology is so important to me, Chuck, because when I read about myself in the pages of the scriptures, yes, I'm in the scriptures. I'm not named. I'm not listed. but the description of the depraved, unrepentant, unyielding sinner I recognized early as my very own. And so Christian particularism, other people may say, it's not fair, God, for you to be particular. I say, God, if you don't save me, I cannot possibly be saved. Because what I see from the scriptures is I see my sinful willfulness to be unwilling. Let's see if I can put it cryptically. I am willingly unwilling to be saved. And so is every other sinner. And the only power in the universe that can change that is the grace of God, acting contrary to that impetus and force that pulls me away from his love. Philippians chapter 2, verses 12 says this. Paul writes, "My dear friends, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. And my free will friends all say," see, game over, Reformed people. Game over, Calvinists. Free will. Says here, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. But then verse 13 finishes the sentence and provides the answer. For it is God who works in you both to will and to act in order to fulfill his good purpose. And that's the whole ball game right there, Chuck. I think people who surmise my will is capable of turning to God at any moment, at any point in time, I can contingently choose to change my willful state towards God. I think those people are profoundly determined by what seems to them unfairness in the doctrine of God's particularism. However, those of us who say, oh no, my will is only against God in my rebellious nature. Now we see the answer in that Philippians verse. It is God who works in you to will and to act. To do what? To continue to work out your salvation in fear and trembling. Salvation is to God's credit from beginning to end. And even my good works, even my faithful response to him, freely chosen, comes about because of the supernatural power of God, working in me to make me willing. And now all of a sudden, instead of Christian particularism looking like an unfair thing, it looks to me like the most beautiful thing in the entire world. For otherwise, without God making me willing, I surely never would come to him. And so there's such teeth, there's such a grip that this doctrine has a hold over me, understanding it from that perspective. And so I think that's behind my focus of investigation with that. Now, Dr. Mouw in this chapter talks about different ethoses, different motifs that he views as coming from the pietism of the historic Calvinism that comes over to our country. One of the motifs he talks about is this remnant view of the church, where Christians see themselves as a little flock inside a hostile world. There's a second motif, almost a motif of antithesis, which, coming from a Kuiperian and Bavinkian situation, is really interesting. Mouw talks about how, in a sense, there is a Christian antithesis that we present to the world that he picks up on. And I was shocked when I thought that, because I had always thought about antithesis in an opposing the gospel sort of way. You know, when non-believers just will not believe, and they close off, and they will not allow themselves. You know, I've always thought about it in that. I never thought about it in a Christian sense, Christian antithesis. And then the third motif is this pessimistic or an apocalyptic assessment of the future course of history. Chuck, these issues strike us so dear because they are the fundamental issues that drive all of the existential questions we face as humans. And that means we want to get them right. So that's my short answer there. What did you think of those motifs that Dr. Mouw brought up, and where they ought to lead in healthy and vigorous discussions?
So yeah, it's a good discussion, and I appreciate Mao's willingness to not just toss off to the side. There's I will say, among some Calvinists who hold to a common grace position, there is occasionally a tendency to sort of just, oh, those pietists, whatever, you know, they don't know what they're talking about. One of the neat things, I think, and it doesn't come across here, but years ago, in an article in the magazine The Banner. The Banner is now the denominational magazine of the Christian Reformed Church. It started out as an independent publication for English speakers in the Christian Reformed Church at a time when the majority were still Dutch speakers. And then over time, as the majority and eventually almost all became English speakers, something that's changing today. There are more and more speakers of Korean and Spanish. But at a time when most people in the Christian Reformed Church spoke English, the Banner was taken over as the denominational magazine. But there was an interesting article years ago that still gets talked about that basically says, look, in sort of our Reformed tradition, and especially in this weird branch of the Reformed tradition that the Christian Reformed Church is part of, this Dutch Reformed tradition, there is strength in the fact that we have sort of three chords of perspective that are tied together and provide strength. And that if we only had one of those chords, it would be a much weaker rope. And having three makes it a much stronger rope. One of those is that old pietistic view that understands that godliness is important, that separation from worldliness is a good thing, right? There are things we must flee in this world. And so that pietist strand is a part of that. There is also, though, very much what often gets called the Kuiperian strand. We could call it the Bavinkian strand, perhaps, as well. But it's really that common grace way of thinking that says, no, we do have to engage the world. We are in the world, even if we're not of it. And being in the world, we have a job as servants of the kingdom. And so as kingdom servants of the kingdom of God, we are placed in this world, and we have a duty to it. We often, those folks will talk about the verse from Jeremiah that talks about being part of the good of the city, and that we have a role in that regard. And that strand too is important because it reminds us of that. And then the third strand that often gets brought in is sort of the Presbyterian strand, the folks and that's the sort of the Puritans and folks who sort of are in sort of the Westminster Confessions, and that's a little bit more of sometimes a more academic or a very precise way of thinking about the confessions. It maybe you could even consider it a stronger confessionalism than you might see from pietists who are really focused on just living a good pious life and being holy, and maybe a little bit more focus on confessions and things like that than you get from the transformationalists, the Kuyperians, who are really working to change the world and bring everything into alignment with God's will. But then there's also this very movement to be much more confessional, and these three things together make us stronger. And to some extent, I think that's what Mouw does here. Is he recognizes, he doesn't quote it, but he recognizes, we need to have those things. So he talks a little bit about how he says, I still endorse the basic pietist insistence that the Christian community must be very conscious of the significant ways in which God calls us to stand against the prevailing cultures of our fallen world. If we lose that pietistic way of thinking, if we cut that cord out of this rope, we've got some potential problems. But there is also this other side of it that says we do need to engage with the world. We need to understand that there is sort of a sense of commonness, a common story for all humanity that goes beyond merely the story of special grace, of the grace that comes from salvation. And this balance is important. We've got to get it right. If we fall too far on one side or the other, there can be a problem. I loved, Brock, that you picked up on this idea of the antithesis, because in this community that talks about these issues, that idea of the antithesis has become very key, because Abraham Kuyper and Herman Bavinck, they talk about these things. There's a quote, I think it comes from Kuyper, but I didn't get a chance to look it up. But there's this quote that says the antithesis runs through the heart of all human beings, meaning that there is a sense in which, there is both good and evil are there. There's a sense that this need for salvation is there, but also there's also the fact that we're made in the image of God, and all humans bear that image, that it runs through us. And there has been some discussion that we sometimes lose the sense of that antithesis if we fall too far on one side or the other of these issues. And that antithesis is a way to sort of keep us centered on the fact that we need both sides of these equations, that we need the insistence on holiness, on this insistence on running away from worldliness, but we also need to also stick with the idea that we are kingdom servants who've been given a task in this world. It's a task that goes beyond, it includes, but it goes beyond just simply saving souls, but it also goes to how do we live in this world? How do we live for the good of the city? And keeping that antithesis at the heart of things is a way sort of to maintain that balance, to thread the needle, to stay on the balance beam without falling off to one side or the other, to ride that bike without falling over to one side or the other. One thing I found, Brock, that just was really interesting to me in this, and it's just part of what Mouw is doing to show that we do have to think about both sides of this equation. I found it really interesting. He quotes a book entitled "Good News in Exile: 3 Pastors Offer a Hopeful Vision for the Church," and he points out that there is this side of sort of commonness that can go so far off that we lose almost that sense that we are different as Christians, and we lose that sense, as you've pointed out, that grace is something that is a gift. It's not something that we're entitled to. And he quotes, for example, Martin Copenhaver, who is a pastor in a congregational church in Massachusetts. I'm guessing it's a church that's part of the United Church of Christ, which is, a very progressive denomination. And Copenhaver says, in a lot of these progressive churches, you get the same kind of sermons on a regular basis. He characterizes it. He says, an atheist friend of mine heard some of this preaching, and he described it really well. It starts with, well, you hear what the psychologist says, you hear what the historian says, you hear what the New York Times editorial writer says, and then the sermon sort of just ends with, and perhaps Jesus said it best, and that's it. Well, what is there to that kind of service? And Copenhaver says, instead of perhaps Jesus said it best, maybe there's an obligation to proclaim you have heard it said, but Jesus says to you, that there's a conflict here, that there is this antithesis that runs through us. And then he also quotes William Willimon, the dean of the chapel at Duke University, and Willimon also sort of, as he puts it, hammers away at what he sees as the mistaken emphasis on continuity, on sort of this continuum between common and special grace in mainline Protestantism. And he takes on the liberal Episcopal Bishop John Shelby Spong. Spong asks how any thoughtful person can expect his physicist daughter to believe in a bodily resurrection. He's like, we're too smart for that kind of stuff. Bodily resurrection, that's all just, it's just stuff that we write down to sort of as an image to help us live ethical lives. And Willimon says, well, the answer to that question, how can we possibly expect his daughter to believe in these things, really depends on Spong's daughter. How little imagination does she now have? The text cannot be blamed if modern people live by epistemologies too limited to enable them to hear the text. We cannot expect people to hear the gospel, Willimon argues, when they are epistemologically enslaved. Oh, wow. Epistemologically enslaved. That's a pretty harsh statement about the progressive church, but it's part of, I just found it really important that Mouw, who often comes, is often seen, as you've described it, as sometimes kind of from that liberal side of the Reformed tradition, is pointing out, there are even now some folks in that progressive tradition who've recognized that there's no there. There's no end to sort of this continuity. If all we have is common grace, pretty soon we don't have grace at all, and we lose it altogether. And that is an important part of this. And as we get into further discussions, as we read in some of these other chapters, I think it would be good always to sort of keep in mind these cautions that Mouw gives us, that we're gonna, it's important. We're gonna talk about common grace, and Mouw very clearly says, look, I am still convinced in this concept of common grace, and I'm still convinced that we need to search for commonness even with unbelievers, but in doing so, we can't go so far down the line that we lose the grace part of common grace, because it is still grace. It is still a gift. It is something that comes from God, and that common grace is separate, it's different from, but also perhaps should point us to that special grace, that saving grace that is necessary for us to be saved, that electing grace. And it's only those who receive that electing grace who will be saved. So I think that's a good reminder as we continue through the various chapters and think about this concept of common grace. Brock, I know we're getting close to the end of our hour. Are there any other points that we haven't sort of made that you want to make sure that we talk about before we finish up today, and then maybe next week get started on lessons from the Labbadists?
Yeah, great questions, my friend. And really what we've done in this discussion session is we've just started opening up where the battle lines are, what the issues are. And that's what this series, looking into Dr. Mouw's ideas, is going to really try to work with. Where do we stand with God? What rights do we have before him? What entitlements can we expect and or demand? What about grace? What does it mean to be gracious? Is grace only for those who are ultimately saved? These are the topics that we're going to be taking on, looking at from a particular position. The idea that you and I hold is the idea of historic confessional Calvinism, which is to say, God does not have an obligation to be gracious. If he had an obligation to be gracious, it wouldn't be grace. But at the same point in time, God's graciousness is not limited solely to the elect. Now, a word about the elect. I was really happy to see Professor Mouw open the chapter with this issue. Jesus loves the little children. Isn't that an inclusive song? The famous lyrics, Dr. Mouw cites them: red and yellow, black and white, they are precious in his sight. Jesus loves the little children of the world. Note what it doesn't say. Jesus loves the little elect, all the elect of the world, red and yellow, black and white. The elect are precious in his sight. And then another bit of poetry that he mentions from his early years. I really like this little poetry snippet. He says, one door, and only one, and yet its sides are two. I'm on the inside. On which side are you? We're going to have to chart a course between the commonness of the human situation, condition, and even God's grace for humankind, and the particularism of saving faith. I think we can do it, Chuck. That's the whole point of our lecture series here. I think we can do it in a biblically faithful way. And so I'm looking forward to seeing how Dr. Mouw develops this further in the rest of the series of lectures written in this book. That's my hope and what I'm looking forward to. Would you give us some final thoughts, my friend, and maybe close us with prayer?
Thanks once again, Brock, for being willing to discuss this book. I really enjoyed talking about it with my friends, and I think I learned from them as well some things, and it's I think going to be an enjoyable discussion, and I appreciate it. And there's going to be some interesting things to walk through and to talk about, and frankly, I think there is some real world implication to how we think about these things that really it makes a difference in how we as Christians act and how we engage with the world around us. It's not a mistake that this book comes from a set of lectures at the Staub Lectures, which is the Staub Lectures are meant to be lectures on issues of ethics and issues of apologetics, and in the end, these issues around common grace really have a big impact on Christian ethics and on how we do apologetics. And so I'm really glad that we're talking about these things. Since we're finished up for the day, let me close in prayer. Our Father in heaven, we confess that no one is righteous. No, not one. No one understands. No one seeks for you. All have turned aside. Together we have become worthless. No one of us does good, not even one. But because of your grace that washes away the darkness of our sin, that washes away the stains of our sin, we are able to now live in the light of your grace. We're able to engage the world as elect people, as people who live under the protection of that grace. And we thank you for that saving grace. We thank you for curbing the depravity of humans that we have because of our sin, by curbing it in us because of your work of grace. But we also thank you for the way that your common grace also curbs and restrains sin in the world around us. What an even more horrible place this world would be if there was no restraint to the sin of those around us. And we praise you for that. We praise you for the delay of judgment that comes because of your common grace. We know that those who are not among the elect will be judged, but there is this delay, and this delay enables us as your people to be your hands and feet in the world, to bring this message of grace. And we don't know who the elect are. There are many people in this world that may appear very much to be among the non-elect, and yet you may have chosen them, and who knows? You may use our minuscule little actions that we can only do because you enable us to live, to be agents of that grace in the world, if not just the common grace that delays judgment, but also the saving grace that saves so many people. We thank you for your goodness towards the creation and how the creation blesses not only those who worship you, but blesses all those in our communities. And we thank you for the blessing that we receive, that our neighbors receive, that the earth receives because of that grace. And we praise you as well that because of that common grace, you give gifts even to sinful men that allow them to perform a kind of good. It's a good that we recognize is not a saving good, but yet good things can happen in this world, even through sinful people, because of this grace, that this common grace that you've bestowed. We praise you and we thank you, O God, because you are the author and you are the giver of grace. And we praise your name. Amen.